Hi, friends. Thanks for joining us at the CHARA Project. I'm Sarah West.
I'm Heather Erickson.
And today we're going to be looking at one of Jesus's teachings. And we often tend to gravitate towards some of the more heartwarming or passages that really make us feel good about Jesus's teachings. But today we're going to be looking at something that might come across a little harsh. And what are we supposed to do with that? And we're going to CHARA it. So our passage today is Matthew 7:22 through 23. And Jesus says, "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'"
That's really encouraging.
Right? Right? So Heather, what do we do with this verse? I mean, first off, what questions do you have about this verse?
One of the best places for us to always start whenever we read the Bible, it's one of the questions in the CHARA guide, is in the research section, and it's asking what are observations or questions we have, because we want to start to kind of grapple with where does our mind go first? For me, this passage makes me wonder, is Jesus disowning us? If he says, "I never knew you," is he saying that there's an opportunity we have to not be known by Jesus?
Right. And just by asking that question, it kind of gives you a starting off point and going, this is what I want to study. I want to find this answer. It gives you some direction.
Yeah, and I may have one question. I may have 10 questions. Today, this one question seems pretty big of trying to figure out, is Jesus disowning us or not?
That's heavy.
What's it going to take? Very, very heavy. But I think we're going to hopefully come to a conclusion that leaves us a little hopeful and helpful along the way.
Please.
So
where would you start, Heather?
We always, more often than not, I feel like we tend to start at context. It seems like the right place to go for this, because we just read only 2 verses in what was a section of scripture that was in Matthew 7. It's right at the tail end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And so if you back out and read just even the verses before, we were in verses 22 and 23. If we were to back out to verses 13 and just go back a few steps, we'd start to see that there's actually, this passage we're reading is one of 4 warnings that Jesus is giving and is trying to help us see. And he ends up saying in both all of these warnings, he gives you 2 options. One highlights how we have eternal life with Jesus or with God, and then what leads to destruction or separation from God. So we see these 2, and let me just read it, because I think this helps put our passage in the right light. The first one is starting in verse 13, chapter 7 of Matthew. It says, "Enter through the narrow gate." So we have gates. "For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it." There's our destruction piece. But then in 14 it says, "But small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only few find it." So our first warning is all about gates and roads, and where there's a narrow road, or there's a wide road, or a narrow gate and a wide gate. And so we already get our first picture of one of our warnings.
And boy, isn't that another one of those passages, something that Jesus said that we're kind of like, I don't know. I tend to, I'm going to push that aside. I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to put that on the shelf.
But no, we don't want to put that on.
Right.
There's a reason why Jesus is saying this. He's trying to paint a picture for us of what is expected, or what is what this passage is what he's trying to get across. So then we keep on moving on. Our second warning comes out starting in verse 15, and it says, "Watch out for false prophets. They are come to you in sheep's clothing, inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do they pick grapes from thorn bushes, or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown out into the fire. Thus, by their fruit you will recognize them." So we're seeing Jesus talking about, our second warning is about 2 trees. The ones that bear good fruit and those that bear bad fruit.
Yeah, you mentioned fruit quite a few times.
There's a lot in there.
And it makes me wonder, what are we supposed to be looking for? What is fruit?
Oh, yeah. So we could write that question down as one of our observations. We could have added that to our questions.
Yeah.
Potentially, we could address that in another Bible study. We may uncover it as we go along. This is a chance for us to be able to say, you know what, I want to come back to this one. But I still want to move on for time's sake. And when we get into verse 21, we start to see our third warning, which is our warning, the one we just read earlier today, which says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of the Father who is in heaven." Let me repeat that again. Not everyone who says, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of the Father who is in heaven. And then it goes on to say, "Many of you will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord.'" And then we get into our passage, and it ends with, I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Now, that's our third thing. We're starting to see a focus on doing the will of God versus those that say the right things about God. This is almost feeling a little personal, in a way, because we could easily say, man, how often am I doing that? This verse is starting to become really real.
Yeah.
But I just want to, before I move on, I want to go to our fourth warning. And what's interesting is in some Bible translations, it will actually have the word therefore. In verse 24, therefore it is a way for us in context to be able to ask, what is it there for? It means that our thought has not been completed. We're still going through. So because these are right after my verses, I need to read right after our verses in verse 24. And it says, therefore, anyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, the wind blew and beat up against the house, yet it did not fall because of its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the wind blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. And then the response of the crowd was amazed at this teaching because they were just shocked by what he was saying. I don't know about you, but I'm starting to see a picture here. We've got two types of gates and roads. We have two different types of trees. We have two different types of commands in our own passage about doing the will of God versus saying. And then at the end, he talks about two different types of people and how they build. And all of them have this theme of that it doesn't matter what we believe in God. If we haven't had a heart change that shows up in how we act. That fruit we were talking about earlier, but again, I think there's more to that fruit question we should pick at. But not everyone's going to choose Jesus and be willing to humbly submit themselves to his will. Like that's what this passage is saying, is that not everybody's going to choose that route. They're going to choose another way. And in seeing these warnings together, we start to understand that this I never knew you it's inferring that there are some people that have never actually followed Jesus. They may say it with their mouth, but they aren't actually aligning their will to Jesus.
I like that you talked about submission to his will. And I think that's a key question here. What is the will of the Father, as it says in verse 21? Because I think these people, they thought they were doing it, right? Because they kept repeating, in your name, I prophesied in your name, I cast out demons in your name, I did miracles in your name. They thought they were doing the will of the Father. They were doing these things, these good works in Jesus' name, and yet Jesus says, I never knew you. So that is a little bit shocking. So what is the will of the Father? And I think that then you touched it in that last warning in verse 24, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them. So I think in context, when we're looking at what is the will of the Father and what is fruit, what is the fruit, is obedience to God.
Yeah.
And listening and acting on his word.
Right. Because there's one thing for me to say with my mouth that Jesus is Lord. It totally is another thing for me to actually live my life as if I do follow him.
Right.
And we see this actually repeated. If we were to, context has been awesome. I feel like we've gotten our answer. I wouldn't stop here just because I would love for us to, I'm a huge cross-reference nerd. I love looking at where else in the Bible has this same concept been taught, just to make sure that my interpretation of this verse is landing with something that isn't contradictory to someplace else in Scripture. And so my natural reaction is to say, I'm going to go and look at some cross-references and see where else this is at. And what's great is, just like a lot of passages in the Gospels, our friend Matthew covered this in his Sermon on the Mount. Luke did as well, but funny enough, he actually covered it in two different places. He has two different spots where he mentions different parts of our passage, in which is just structure. Just a reminder, Gospels were not chronological. And so if they are out of order, it's not because they're wrong. It's because the authors were emphasizing different things. And so they would sometimes mix up the stories in different orders. But Luke covers it in Luke 6, verse 46 through 49, where he says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and you do not do what I say? I show you that he's like those who come to me and hear my words and put them into practice. Let me say that again. I will show you what he is like who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice. He's like a man building a house. Have we heard this analogy before? who dug down deep and laid the foundation on the rock. When a flood came, and he ends up going in and talking about that builder of the full foundation. They are the ones that are hearing who Jesus is and are acting on it, and they're actually following him. That's how Luke interprets this "I never knew you" passage. And then he goes on in Luke 13. Again, cross references were my best friend in this venture. But he goes on in Luke 13, verse 25 through 27 says, once the owner of a house gets up and closes the door and will be standing outside knocking and pleading, "Sir, open the door for us." And he will answer, "I don't know you or where you came from." And they will say, "We ate and drank with you and taught in our streets." But he will reply, "I don't know you or where you came from. Away from me, you evildoers." And it is in the same passage that Luke is repeating the story of the narrow door. And the fact that there's a narrow door and there's a wide door. And so we see Luke emulating the same concept. It's the same application that we had before, is that it's not everybody's going to choose Jesus or do his will. And so it doesn't matter what we say. And if we say we believe in God, it has more to do about our heart change.
What's interesting that in that last Luke passage you read, where they say that we ate and we drank with you, I think there's a little bit of a wake-up call here, right? Like, I knew you, Lord. I ate and drank with you. I did miracles in your name. I knew you. Or so they thought. They thought they knew him. Or they thought by their actions that they were
right. Yeah.
justified.
I did the checklist, Lord. I was hanging out with you.
Yeah.
And what's crazy is when we do a little bit more cross-reference digging. If I stay in this context place, but go and answer the question about, does this hold true throughout the Bible? Okay. We've looked at immediate context, and that's where we've been hunkering. If I were to go out a little bit farther across the Bible and say, does this interpretation that I'm starting to gain run true throughout different passages, we see, and I just have a couple here. One is James 1:22 says, "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says."
There's that deceive word again. Oh. We do deceive ourselves.
Well, yeah, I'm my best. I'm the best one at telling myself a lie about what I am doing, and I can easily get myself to think differently than what I'm actually going to do. 1 John 3:18 says, "Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth." Another verse that popped up was even the demons believe. I don't have the passage in my notes here, but I think oftentimes we're like, yeah, we believe. Yeah, we easily say that we are yours, Lord. But even the demons believe that Jesus existed.
Yeah, and that he was the Son of God.
And that he was the Son of God.
That's a really great point.
Right? And so I think we can easily get stuck in this idea that just because we know and we say that covers it.
Right. If there's not a submission, right? Like, I believe you exist. I believe you are who you say you are, but I don't submit to you.
No.
Yeah.
And so the last verse I came across was in 1 Corinthians 3, where it talks about love. It's like, if I speak in tongues of men and angels and do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have not the gift of prophecy or fathom the mysteries of all knowledge, and if I have not have faith that can move mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor, and I give over my body to the hardship that I may boast, but I do not have love, I gain nothing. And I think we sometimes forget that there's a lot of times our actions can come through, but it can be a gong or a clanging cymbal, because it doesn't have the motive, the heart change of knowing who Jesus is and his love. That is the reason why we are loving others. We're doing it for a different agenda.
Boy, and you really see that. I mean, as you mentioned in the beginning, we're in Matthew 7, which is the end of the Sermon on the Mount. But you do see that same theme throughout Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. Back in Matthew 5, the heart behind the actions matter. God cares about the heart.
Right. Well, and that's actually, wow, you just segued me, and I don't even think you meant to do it. But one of the next questions I like to ask when studying scripture is, well, who are they talking to? Like, this is a history question of who is it written to? Who is it written about? Because it makes me want to understand, okay, who's this audience? Just to make sure, is this something that was meant for just them, or is it meant for me today? And how can I apply it today? What's crazy is right at the beginning of Matthew, we see our audience actually identified, because that's the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. We see Jesus standing at this mountainside, and he's hanging out with all these people, and it actually describes them in the audience as a large crowd from Galilee and Decapolis and Jerusalem and Judea and this regions across the Jordan. But they were likely a mix of disciples and religious leaders. And if we know that a lot of maybe the disciples were probably very much following Jesus, But the Pharisees may have been putting their acts ahead of what they would have thought as being followers of God. Jesus is calling out both of these crowds and saying, you need to check your heart here a little bit. And I love that we see a mixed crowd that he's hanging out with, because it helps us realize this is a message for every type of person. For those that think that they're religious,
Yes.
those that are, coming as a tax collector like Matthew was, one of his disciples, or fishermen, people that were the lowest of the low. This is a message for everybody.
I love that. It's so helpful. The audience matters. Who are they speaking to and why? That helps. And that's one of our history questions. Are there any other history questions that you would gravitate towards?
One of the questions, and sometimes it can be hard to find, and I'll use a study Bible or other notes to be able to help kind of grasp this one. But a history question is, why was this message given to those people at that time? So when we see the Old Testament, the Jewish people had been taught that by following the law, that only way they could have right standing with God was by keeping that law. And when Jesus comes in, his sermon is upside down from that, because he's not teaching that piece, but he's teaching about it being less about the actions of the law and more about the heart. Man, we've already studied this in a passage that we've had done on this podcast in Matthew 5:48. It has less to do about our actions and more to do with our heart. And so when we understand the Jewish perspective of them wanting to keep the law in order for them to be able to have an audience with God someday in heaven, that changes your perspective to say, he's telling them that that's not what really matters. It's not what you do, and what you say you do. It has more to do with your heart.
So I love that question of why, right? Why was this message given to them? And it makes me wonder, what would their response have been? I mean, so one of the questions also under history is, how would the original audience have heard this? I think, wouldn't this have been a wake-up call?
Huge.
Like, he's in the whole Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is turning upside down, like you said, their understanding of righteousness and the kingdom. So this would have been a complete wake-up call that, wait a minute, to enter the kingdom is maybe different than I thought. It's not about, right, the actions and all that. I need to know you. I need to submit to you. So that's great.
Oh, well, and you again segued me so beautifully, because
You're welcome.
Thank you. The thing that I would normally look at is say, well, are there research? If I go to my research section of my CHARA guide, are there resources that I could gain some insights from biblical scholars, whether it's a study Bible or a commentary? And what's crazy is those commentaries that I came across had a very similar answer to your question about that original audience.
Oh, good. Okay.
This was really kind of fascinating. They were actually, the Bible Knowledge Commentary was one of the first places I went, and it said that those hearing the sermon must have wondered about the religious leaders, who seemed to be good men, teaching spiritual truths about the Messiah and his kingdom. Jesus made it clear they were not good, for they were leading the others astray, even if they were doing supernatural deeds, prophesying in his name, driving out demons.
All that good fruit.
All that great fruit, performing miracles. They were not obedient to the Father. So continually doing his will, they refused to in admission to the kingdom, because Jesus had no personal relationship with them. That's what this Bible commentary said. And I loved that it tied it to that relationship, because these people would have thought, I got it all. I know exactly what I'm doing. And Jesus is calling them out on it. The other commentary that I ended up coming across is my Warren Wiersbe, the Bible exposition commentary. And it says, words are not a substitute for obedience, and neither are religious works. Preaching, casting out demons, performing miracles can be divinely inspired, but they give no assurance of salvation. Whoa. It's likely that even Judas participated in some of all these activities, and yet he was not a true believer.
That's a good point.
And I was like, man, when I read that, I was like, that's a great point, because here you have a disciple sitting, eating dinner, hanging out, casting out, like doing all the things that disciples did, spreading the fame of Jesus. He was doing all the right things, but his heart wasn't in the right place.
That's a good point. And I love that both of those also that you just read, they did reference obedience, and that God cares about obedience over our good works or our good words. That an obedience and a submission, they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Right. Submitting to the will of the Father. So I love that there was that shout out there. Okay, so Heather, we've done research, we've done history, we looked at context.
I mean, we could spend time in author if we wanted to. I don't think for us to be able to apply this verse, I think we've been circling around some of these themes
Yeah.
already that we could
Okay.
we could jump to apply. And if we do, one of the first questions I love to ask is what fears or concerns as I'm applying this, are things that I need to be conscious of, I need to be aware of. Where are those fears and concerns? And I don't know about you, but when I was reading this verse, this idea of this, I never knew you.
Yeah.
How do we know that Jesus is going to claim us as his?
That's real.
It is.
Yeah.
It's completely real. But now I also understand that based on what I've read in context and I understand in the history and some further research, I also know that it has less to do about what I do and has more to do with my heart and my relationship with him. Am I submitting myself to him? Right? John, throughout John in the upper room in the verses, chapter 13 through 17 talks a lot about aligning your heart or abiding or remaining in God. That submission, that ability to say, I'm aligned with you, God.
Right. Made me think of pick up your cross daily and follow him.
That's exactly
His
it.
will over my will.
That's right. That's right.
And that's, that trips up a lot of us.
Uh-huh.
We kind of like our will and our way.
Wait, what? I'm not a control freak. I don't know what you're talking about. That's not me at all. As I say in our house, that was sarcasm. So we have to announce it at our house just to make sure that we are very clear.
Help train the children.
A little bit, or myself.
What is funny and what is not?
Exactly. That, yeah. So another question I might ask during apply is, what did I learn about God? This is a huge question. We love asking this question because when we realize what we learn about God from this is that it has more to do about our relationship with him. It has more to do about our heart with him. And he cares more about that than all of these checklists of things that we love to say we do for him. If I can, come home at night and say, oh, Lord, my husband, I did this, and this. I don't think that's exactly what God's looking for in my relationship with him. My husband wouldn't be asking that of me. No relationship is saying, what did you do for me lately?
Right.
They shouldn't be. That's not the right of a relationship. A relationship cares more about, are you connected to me? Do you have a tie with me? Are we honoring each other? And God is asking for us to be honoring to him and submissive to him. That's why wouldn't I want to do that? Because, man, he's an amazing God.
I love that. And I love that you stress that relationship and to have a relationship with God. What that looks like and what I'm seeing shouting out from this passage is to know my word and to obey it, right? Part of having a relationship with God is knowing his word.
Oh, that's good.
And submitting to his word. And it's right here. And that's what we're trying to do by taking, one of these sticky passages and trying to carve it, trying to understand it. What was Jesus saying?
Oh, I love that because there's no better way to have a relationship with God if you're not in his word.
Yeah.
If you are not studying the Bible on a regular basis, how do you know where his heart is, what he is, wanting, to in our relationship with him? You don't understand God if you're not in the Word. So I love that you brought that up. That's a great reminder, and the reason why we're doing this. And I'm leaving this passage feeling quite encouraged. I started early off with wow, that could be overwhelming, or at least I'm hoping we're feeling this way.
Yeah.
But there's still one more apply that you may want to put into practice. Okay. If you're studying this passage, that you may want to go to God and pray, in almost any passage and pray.
That's a good point.
Pray
every time.
Every time we should be doing this. And we would normally pray some kind of prayer where you have, Lord, what did you want me to learn in this passage? How should I be applying this to my life? And so when I was praying over this passage and as we were preparing for today, my prayer was, Jesus, help us reevaluate the motive behind our actions. Are we doing things because we have to in order to get a right standing with you? Are we doing it because it looks good on the outside? Or are we living out these verses, changing our heart posture toward you to follow your will and let your actions be a get to? It being an outpouring of our love for you. So help us align our will to yours, and maybe we changed from the inside out.
Oh, amen.
Right? Like that is the ultimate hope. And that's what gives me hope in this verse, is that Jesus is just calling us to be in closer connection and relationship. He doesn't want lip service.
Right.
And man, I wouldn't want to be in a relationship with someone that was giving me lip service either. So
right.
I get it. I get it.
Well, hopefully this was hopeful and helpful, and hopefully it gives us the confidence to maybe take some of those verses that we've been putting on that shelf, or the ones we quite frankly we just don't know what to do with. And to tackle them, to dive into them, and to try to understand the heart behind them, what we can learn about God. And I love that you ended with a prayer, and pray over those. God, how do I interpret this? What am I supposed to do with this? So hopefully that it gives all of us some encouragement to actually tackle some of those passages, which we will continue doing. So make sure you subscribe and join us on our next podcast, and we'll continue doing that with you.